Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to bring this committee hearing to order. Before we get it started, I want to, and I know Senator Ayotte joins me in this, reflect for a moment on the tragedy that took place a couple days ago with the Navy Yard. Obviously, as so many elected officials and others have said, our prayers are with the victims and their families and all the first responders at the scene. And 5 of the 12 victims were Virginians, and we in Virginia already know too much about the destruction wrought by such trauma. So again, our thoughts and prayers are with those, and clearly we need to find out on a going forward basis how we can make these installations more secure. That's obviously the subject of another matter, but I thought it was appropriate that we at least acknowledge that this morning. We do want to welcome our witnesses and guests today to the Budget Committee's Governmental Performance Task Force on enhancing accountability and improving financial transparency. And I want to again thank Ranking Member Senator Ayotte for joining today on this important topic. I have to acknowledge when I first got to the Budget Committee, having been a governor and somewhat obsessed about these issues, I think there was an effort made by the then chair to say, how can we make sure that Werner doesn't cause too much of a pain in the neck? So they gave me this working area. I'm not sure if you got stuck with that same responsibility, but this notion that we've got to find ways to make our government more accountable, more efficient, better value for our taxpayer dollars is something that a lot of members talk about, but to kind of dig in and do the hard work on how we actually get there is a bit more of a challenge. So that's, again, where we bring today's hearing. It is long overdue, incredibly important. We've got to do a better job of figuring out and decoding for the American public how our federal dollars are actually spent and what kind of value for the buck we get. Over the past several years, I've been working on this area of financial transparency. There are similar efforts in the House, and we'll come back to that in a moment. This should be an area where I think there should be a great deal of bipartisan accord, and actually should be an area that I hope we can, on this issue of the Data Act, actually move forward. We're about to go into budget debate part 4 or part 5 coming up, I think, right now, as we think about debt ceilings, super committees, fiscal cliffs. I somehow fear that this next round may be, while there's public fatigue on some of this issue, this next round could actually be one of the most challenging because there seems to be even less path forward than we've seen in the past. And while we will work through part of this, a corollary to the budget issues are the issues of, okay, even once we hit these top line numbers, how do we make sure that those numbers, whatever they are spent in a more effective and efficient manner? And that is, again, the work of this task force. I believe very strongly that our federal government, and I didn't come to this totally as a neophyte. I came as a former business guy and a governor. Until I got this job, I didn't fully appreciate how completely inefficient much of our federal government was in terms of its organization, its structure, and clearly issues around transparency. This year, the GAO identified hundreds of duplicative programs across federal agencies. For example, and I know this is something that Senator Coburn has pointed out a number of times, but I 100% agree with him. We have 82 different wind-related energy programs in 6 different agencies. You can't get good value for your dollar if you've got what limited resources we have around wind energy spread amongst 82 different programs in 6 different agencies. Unless we develop better data and processes to weed out ineffective programs, we'll never have the efficient structure that will support our long-term budget goals, whatever that top line number might be. One of the stats that I think about every day is that every day our debt grows by $4 billion. So there is nothing self-correcting about the size of our close to now $17 trillion debt that won't come about by concerted bipartisan action. Part of that also will mean how we make sure that the dollars we are spending are spent more efficiently. We don't have the right answer. I don't believe we have. I don't believe that we have the right information to answer the very basic questions about, as we send these federal dollars out, how are they spent, where are they spent, how are they categorized being spending. The remarkable thing is, I believe we have over 100 different financial reporting systems just within the DOD. You know, something that appears as a grant in one area comes out as an expenditure in another area. And if you're a taxpayer or if you're a senator trying to do responsible oversight, I just don't think we can do our job. There has been small progress. One of the things I'm very proud of, we passed back in 2010 the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act, GPRA. I like to call it the smallest little bill that nobody's ever heard of, that actually, for the first time ever, requires the administration to report a couple of things they never wanted to report before. One, not only what are their best performing programs, but their least performing programs. Everybody likes to highlight our successes. One of the things we do a dreadful job in government is talking about those programs that aren't that effective. And as Senator Ayotte knows, having run back in New Hampshire a large department in terms of Attorney General, I'm running a state. If you've got a governmental agency that has 50 or 60 different goals, then really they have no goals. Unless you can narrow your goals and priorities to a definable number, you're not going to get the kind of productivity that we'd need. So GPRA also took that very important action. It was long overdue. And because of this legislation, we now have the first inventory of all federal programs, and agencies, as I mentioned, are now identifying both high and low priority programs, as well as providing the kind of quarterly update that we and Congress and taxpayers should see on a regular basis. But we still got a long way to go on performance data. And I think we are seeing gradual improvement. However, we need to make sure we take new steps to improve the quality of financial data available. If you take a closer look at the GAO duplication report, you will notice that about half of those 82 wind-related energy programs do not have funding information. We've got these programs out there and you don't know the funding information. How can anyone and we've been working to try to make that actually something that's achievable. So since the federal government spends more than $3.7 trillion each year, with more than $1 trillion of that $3.7 trillion in awards, accurately tracking these funds in a consistent way can be a big job. And the data collected by the budget shops, the accountants, and the procurement officers and grant makers should all be combined and reconciled in a more relevant, user-friendly, and transparent way. And we have legislation now in front of us that I think will take at least a step in that direction. The various systems should be available to work together based on consistent financial standards so that policymakers and the public can track the full cycle of federal spending. And that's what the legislation that this hearing is at least indirectly is all about. The Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, or DATA, that's what this act will do. And I'm pleased that Rob Portman has been the co-sponsor of this act. We've worked on this for a couple of years. I would love to have Senator Ayotte and other members who may have staff members here joining us. This DATA Act in the House actually passed out of their Government Performance Committee in a bipartisan, I believe, unanimous way, in a committee that had, I think at that point, Ranking Member Issa and or Chairman Issa and Ranking Member Cummings. That kind of diversity on that committee to pass out almost bipartisan or almost unanimously, and I think it did pass unanimously, means we ought to be able to do the same. And I hope that other members of this Budget Working Committee will sign on. Let me just very briefly go through the four improvements that data will make, and then I want to turn to Senator Ayotte and our very important witnesses. First, it creates transparency for all federal funds. The Data Act will expand the current site of usspending.gov to include spending data for all federal funds by appropriation, federal agency, program, function, as well as maintain the current reporting for federal awards like contract grants and loans. This expansion of USAspending.gov will allow policymakers and the public to actually track from start to finish federal funds more clearly and make the link between spending and budget priorities. This is very, very important in terms of bringing clarity. Second, it sets government-wide financial data standards. Our task force closely monitored the effects to increase the transparency for Recovery Act funds. And the reason that oversight was so successful was that they finally had consistent standards for reporting the data. And our taxpayers were able to tell where the funds and projects were located in their community. So the Data Act requires the Department of Treasury, and rather than an earlier version of this act that would have created a whole new agency, we said, let's go ahead and build upon the very good work that's done at Treasury. And I think, again, we've got colleagues in the House to agree with this, to establish government-wide financial data standards for federal agencies to expand the transparency across the whole government. Having these common standards cannot be stressed enough as an importance. If anybody who's had any background in business and finance, you got to have common standards. Third, this actually, one of the things we do in Congress is we always add and layer on more and more reporting requirements. Sometimes I think we add on so much additional reporting requirements that many of the good federal workers spend way too much of their time doing duplicative reporting rather than actually getting us information in an efficient and timely manner. So the Data Act actually requires OMB to review existing federal financial reporting to reduce compliance costs based on new financial data standards. I've been concerned about the compliance costs for the recipients of federal funds. It appears with all these overlapping systems, we are asking many of these recipients to actually report multiple times to multiple agencies in a way that does not improve transparency at all. And I know we're going to hear from the witnesses on that issue. Finally, it improves data quality. Under the Data Act, the Inspector Generals at each agency will be required to provide a report every 2 years on the quality and accuracy of the financial data provided by USAspending.gov. The GAO will also create a government-wide scorecard on data quality and accuracy. Again, these things get kind of wonky, but they are all very, very important in moving forward in an area where we're going to have continued limited financial resources. We must have a reliable system in place to track federal funds and compare spending across federal agencies to get the best value for taxpayers and reduce duplication. Again, I want to particularly thank Senator Ayotte for being willing to join me in this task force as the ranking member. As we see by perhaps the lack of other attendance, this may not be the sexiest issue out there, but if we're going to get to the core of both getting the top line right for our budget, but also making sure that how those dollars that we do allocate are spent more efficiently, we've got to have these kind of standards in place. And with that, I turn it over to Senator Ayotte.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually think transparency is sexy. So I think this is important for the government, and I really believe that your efforts in the Data Act are excellent. So my staff has been reviewing it, and one of the things I like about it is that we keep creating more requirements for federal programs, but are we getting more transparency? Are we getting any metrics that measure whether we're going to have the efficiency and effectiveness of federal programs? So I really appreciate your efforts here. And I think this is a very overlooked area of the importance of government. The more transparency we have, the more accountability that the federal government has from our constituents. And there's such great frustration, understandably, with the American people that if they can't figure out where money is spent in Washington, then there's no accountability. They can't ask questions of their elected officials, and they can't decide whether something is worth the money that they are giving the federal government and their investment, because it is their money at the end of the day. And one of the things that we see so much in Washington is we see the examples of all kinds of wasteful spending, right? So, I mean, I have multiple examples here of just recent examples. Last week, the Government Accountability Office released a report in which it estimated that the Social Security Administration made $1.2 billion in potential cash benefit overpayments to about 36,000 individuals in January of 2013. Other examples from almost every department in the federal government. I have an example here from the Department of Transportation IG report. The Maritime Administration did not establish effective oversight mechanisms when it carried out its port infrastructure development responsibilities. In one case identified in the report, MARAD was authorized to administer funds for developing and modernizing the Port of Anchorage. The cost estimate for this program was originally $211 million, and it actually came in at $1 billion. So this is just, I have a whole host of examples. Mark has looked at all those examples over the years as well. And our constituents get rightly frustrated with when they are going through hard times at home and they are having to adhere to a budget and not spend money that they don't have. When we are nearly $17 trillion in debt here, and we're where we are thinking about that there isn't this type of openness within our government. And the chairman pointed out about the GAO reports on all of the duplicative programs, and there have been many, not just in the wind area that you've identified, for example, job training programs, multiple examples where we have had duplicative programs. And I think one of the issues and challenges we face is there's no measurement of effectiveness. So I do appreciate the effort that you've made with your prior legislation, but we need to have, if we're going to expend taxpayer dollars, the type of transparency we also need is measurements and metrics of effectiveness. You know, Ronald Reagan once said that there's nothing closer to eternal life than a government program. Why is that? The reason for that is because we aren't measuring effectiveness. We don't have the type of transparency we have in our government, and so therefore things continue under the radar screen when they may have outlived their usefulness, or there may be other programs that are much more effective in accomplishing the purpose that the program set out to achieve. And so I appreciate very much all of you being here today. This is a very important topic. And if we can get things like this right in terms of transparency, openness in our government, and more accountability for government programs, then we can address the larger issues, the fiscal challenges that we face, and people will have more confidence that when they pay taxes, that actually that money is going to something that is useful and productive for our nation. And we owe it to our constituents that they can hold us accountable when we make decisions on how to expend taxpayer dollars. And so I look forward to hearing from all of you here today, and I very much appreciate the efforts you've made in this area, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And again, I want to echo what you've just said, is that too often when we come up with these examples, it's only after the GAO or somebody else has done a report way after the fact.
Right.
You know, if we had this data on a more current basis, we had it on a more transparent basis, not only would we as members of Congress be able to do this, but, you know, we've got a pretty active public out there that would help us in this issue.
Absolutely. We could stop the waste before it happens, which would be the goal. And you're right. The public would be pointing this out to us. And I think that every time we see one of those examples, we know that there are 5 more that someone hasn't discovered, right? So this is a very important hearing, and I appreciate what we're doing here today.
And I also, and the only counter I would also add as well, and we do want to get to the witnesses. I apologize for both of us going on, but there's also good things that are going on too. And if we highlight the successes as well, that's part of the balance. So again, I want to welcome today's witnesses. And let me go through a very brief introduction because we really want to hear from you. First, we welcome Stanley Czerwinski, Director of Strategic Issues at GAO. Mr. Czerwinski will share GAO's recommendations for expanding transparency and efforts in recent years to improve the data on usaspending.gov. Obviously, GAO has been the single biggest arm of the government who has been an activist for these type of activities. And Mr. Czerwinski, we really appreciate you being here. Next, we have Mr. Thomas Lee, Director of the Sunlight Labs at the Sunlight Foundation. Mr. Lee is going to share recommendations for improving financial transparency from the Sunlight Foundation's Clear Spending Report. Prior to his current role, he managed the Sunlight Subsidioscope. Well, that's a fancy word. An effort to explore the level of federal involvement in various sectors of the economy. Subsidioscope. Maybe you can explain where that word came from. And then our final witness today is Mr. Gerald J. Kane, Assistant Vice President for Research Administration at the University of Virginia. Next hearing, we'll have somebody from UNH.
There definitely is a Virginia theme here.
I understand. Mr. Kane, thank you for joining us today to share your experience from more than 25 years in research administration. Mr. Kane is going to talk about, beyond his great background at UVA, the kind of duplicative burdens that we put on researchers, not only at UVA, but at every university across America, and ways that we might be able to do some improvements. So, gentlemen, thank you again for being here, and we'll start with Mr. Czerwinski.
Well, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Ayotte, thank you very much for having this hearing. And no need to apologize to go on about accountability, transparency, GPRA. This is what we live at GAO, so you could have talked forever and we would have been happy. And also thank you for having this hearing that coincides with the release of our report, and Mr. Chairman for requesting that report. When it comes to transparency, our view is that Congress has been visionary and a leader. And the examples we think about, in 2006, Congress gave us usaspending.gov. In 2009, Congress gave us recovery.gov. And now we have data in front of us. And our view in our report is that to keep the momentum going, you need more legislation. And that is at the heart of our report, is that we believe that legislation is required to keep up the momentum on transparency. So that's one thing that I want to focus on today. Another is the need to have standardization. As you mentioned in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, the heart of good transparency in terms of efficiency and accuracy is going to be at standardization, and I'll talk more about that too. And finally, I want to speak a little bit about the need to involve stakeholders, because if you're talking about having something that affects the recipients of the funds, you want to get their input to make it work most effectively and actually to have them work most effectively. So those are the three themes I'd like to hit. But before that, I'd like to spend a moment and just talk about where we are today in terms of leadership for transparency. Right now, the leadership for transparency is centered in the GATT board, the Government Accountability and Transparency Board. This is made up of members of the grant and contract making agencies, as well as the inspectors general. The key members of the board are from OMB, DOD, HHS, Treasury. It's headed up by Dick Ginman, who is the contract officer for DOD. The vice chair is Dave Williams, who's the Postal Inspector General. Kathy Tai, who is the head of the RAT board, the Recovery Accountability Transparency Board, as well as the Education IG, are all key members. So our view is you have the right people, they have the right focus, but there's an inherent limitation in what they can do based on their governance. The GATT board does not have clear lines of authority. It does not have its own funding. So they are dependent upon a loosely knit configuration of the grant-making and contract-making agencies to carry out their work. And this has a limitation as to how far they can take it. In terms of standardization, I think this gives a really good example of where the limitation comes into effect. For standardization, what you want is every agency to name things the same way across all agencies. And that way, what it does, it links up the award with a payment. The beauty of this is that the payments are already audited, so you have complete, accurate, consistent data on payments that right now we can't link up with awards, so you can't have a cradle to grave. But if you have standardization, you can do this. The other piece of standardization that's very good is that it's efficient. It allows for pre-population of the data systems. We're not asking people to do over and over again information that we already have, and frankly, that we already have right. So when you're entering over and again, it's just more work. It can introduce more errors. So standardization is a win-win. And the GAD board believes in standardization, as do we, but they do not have the power to compel it. So what they've done instead is take an incremental approach. In working with OMB, there's guidance out there right now that says agencies should have unique identifiers, but only within their agency. Therefore, we can't have the cross-government look. And that's what's essential. And I know you'll hear more from the other witnesses about standardization. So I want to move on then to stakeholder input. A contrast between what we have now and what we had with recovery.gov is the way stakeholders were involved. I believe that in recovery.gov, you have probably among the best examples of involving those who had to do the work. When we rolled out recipient reporting on recovery.gov, OMB and the RAT board both reached out to the stakeholders, state and local governments, research institutions, nonprofits, Sunlight, and said, well, how should we do this? And the guidance came across that way. Then once it was implemented, there were lessons learned. How's it going? There were challenges, there were changes. And in doing that, what happened was the guidance was improved instantaneously. Also, the capacity of those to report was enhanced. And very quickly under recovery.gov, we had accurate, complete, consistent data. So I can't overemphasize the importance of stakeholders. And again, I think you'll hear more about that today. In doing our work, we talk to stakeholders. So, for example, we talk to Sunlight, we talk to research institutions, we talk to state and local governments. We also had discussions with all the major federal players, DOD, OMB, HHS, Treasury, the RAT board, the GAT board. What we do in our work is that when we've then done our reports, we give the federal agencies a chance to comment and to give us their reactions. In this case, the reactions focused on the three things I mentioned: the need for legislation, the importance of standardization, and the value involving stakeholders. In all cases, all the federal agencies concurred in what we found, what we analyzed, and what we recommended. So with that, I'd like to conclude my statement. If you have questions, be glad to answer.
Chairman. Okay, thank you. My name is Tom Lee, and I'm director of Sunlight Labs, the technical arm of the Sunlight Foundation. Sunlight is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to using the power of the internet to catalyze greater government transparency and openness. We take inspiration from Justice Brandeis's famous adage that sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants. We believe that data on government spending is among the most important measures that citizens have of their government's priorities. Public spending data allows us to cut through political rhetoric and see for ourselves what expenditures the government prioritizes over others. If it's timely enough, it also allows private industry, local governments, and service delivery organizations to align their plans and investments with those made here in Washington. Since USAspending.gov launched in 2007, Sunlight researchers have become very familiar with its underlying data systems. And what we found is troubling. Our data quality analysis of the assistance data in USA Spending shows that it's deteriorating by the year. In 2011, over $900 billion of the direct assistance data on the site was misreported. For example, according to USAspending.gov, the United States spent $0 on Medicare insurance and $0 on Medicare prescription drugs in 2011, 2012, and 2013. And although in testimony to the House Oversight Committee, the CIO of the Department of Education asserted that when he looks at his agency's data in USA Spending, it's accurate, USA Spending currently shows that no money was spent on student loans from 2008 to 2012. Despite these loans comprising one of the department's largest assistance programs. But these data sets...
Mr. Lee, I don't mean to interrupt, but how is that possible?
I think that the fundamental problem is a lack of clear guidance and centralization of authority about what should be reported. But various justifications have been used for this lack of reporting, including the idea that the ultimate beneficiary of the spending is an individual, which is exempted from reporting under FAFATA. But we've seen this excuse used in, for example, school lunch programs, where grants are given to schools with the rationale that ultimately it's the children who are receiving this who are individuals, and therefore the spending doesn't need to be reported. So I think this speaks to the lack of centralization of authority. Really, just historically, there hasn't been someone paying close attention to what is and isn't being reported. But to continue, these data sets are not only full of bad data, they're also badly designed. A lack of standardization makes it difficult to conduct the type of data quality analysis that Sunlight has in the first place, and contributes to agencies and recipients' inability to report accurate, timely, and complete data about their spending. Without government-wide data standards to facilitate interoperability, using complementary data sets as a cross-check to identify data quality problems will remain limited. And without better non-proprietary identifiers for recipients of federal dollars, spending transparency efforts will never fully deliver on the promise to reduce fraud and waste that Senator Ayotte has referred to. Without an integrated approach to budget, spending, and disbursement data, attempts to measure programs' efficiency and effectiveness will be stymied. While the aims of USAspending.gov are laudable, it's failed to fulfill its promise to allow the American public to see where their dollars are being spent. We believe that further legislative action is needed to allow the site to achieve its mission. Sunlight has long been a supporter of the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, or DATA Act, which would mandate that the Department of Treasury create a set of government-wide standards to facilitate better spending reporting. The DATA Act would also make spending data more complete. One of the main drawbacks of the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, or FFATA, the law that created USAspending.gov, is that it only requires the posting of direct assistance and contracts data. This means that much of the money spent on general government operations, including over $350 billion annually in salaries, is not present on USAspending.gov. Indeed, if you were to view overall spending by agency on USA Spending, you might get the mistaken impression that agencies that rely more heavily on contract personnel spend more money than agencies that do not, since permanent employees' salaries are not disclosed. The DATA Act would correct this problem. Under FFATA, the Government Accountability Office was required to report on the implementation of USA Spending 1 year after the passage of the Act. This report, issued in 2010, noted several problems with the site's data. The DATA Act would formalize and distribute this oversight role across the Inspector General offices at each federal agency, requiring IGs to report every 2 years on the quality of the data submitted. While Sunlight has been pleased to conduct our own data quality analysis, we believe that the Inspectors General could perform a more thorough audit than our resources and access allow. The benefits of improving this data will accrue not only to the American public, but also to government. The historically low levels of fraud associated with Recovery Act spending are a testament to the savings that well-executed spending transparency measures can deliver. We believe that investments in improving federal spending oversight and disclosure are overwhelmingly likely to pay for themselves in smarter and less error-prone spending decisions. We applaud the efforts of both the administration and this Congress to increase the transparency of federal spending. Recent proposed regulations for streamlining award and contract identifiers across agencies are a meaningful step forward. Sunlight's a supporter of the administrative initiatives in this area, but we also believe that a mandate for publishing all federal spending should be grounded in law to demonstrate and formalize our government's lasting commitment to transparency about how tax dollars are spent. We welcome the committee's attention to this issue and encourage you to continue to engage with spending transparency as it relates to your work. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering any other questions you might have.
Good morning, Chairman Warner and Ranking Member Ayotte, and members of the task force. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on the transparency and federal reporting requirements. My name is Jerry Kane, and I'm the Assistant Vice President for Research Administration at the University of Virginia. UVA is a nonprofit public institution of higher education located in Charlottesville, Virginia. In fiscal year 2012, the university received research awards totaling over $306 million from all sources, of which 80% came from the federal grants and contracts. The Office of Research Administration supports the research endeavors of university faculty, ensures the responsible stewardship of research funding, and oversees the submission of proposals, negotiation, and acceptance of awards by the university according to state, university, and sponsor regulations. With such a large research portfolio, UVA interacts with a variety of federal agencies, including the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense, and others. As the task force examines legislation to create greater transparency in federal spending and standardize across agencies, I would like to highlight several examples of duplication and burdensome reporting requirements that do not increase transparency, but rather increase the cost of compliance at our public institution. In order to comply with federal reporting requirements, we are required to submit numerous reports at different time frames, many of which include the same information in different formats. For example, I'll use the National Institutes of Health. The NIH is the largest federal funder of research at the University of Virginia, and its funding has led to numerous medical breakthroughs. As one example, recently the School of Medicine received a 5-year, $14 million grant in a consortium with other universities to develop methods to better predict which heart disease patients are at the greatest risk of heart failure and sudden death. This type of award will require us to submit yearly and quarterly financial reports, subcontract monthly reports, and annual principal investigator progress reports. Were this grant an American Recovery and Reinvestment Act award, it would require all of the above and additional quarterly reports. This information is collected despite the invoicing process, which additionally collects information each time funding is drawn down from a grant. This reporting schedule is normal for most federal grants across the agencies. So these issues of redundancy are relevant to many agencies, not just NIH. Another example of inefficiency is our experience with agencies losing reports we have filed, which causes additional work refiling. It would be much more efficient to set up a federal report repository where we upload the same form for all agencies. Then the agencies could reference and download the reports at their convenience. A third area of our concern is invoicing. This is one of the most difficult tasks our office has with agencies, as they use different systems and some use multiple systems. This causes confusion, extra work to determine the appropriate system. A key element that would improve invoicing and reporting efficiency across agencies would be to allow universities and others awardees to upload all data electronically at one time for multiple awards. This would save many staff hours. On a positive note, we've seen one recent improvement, which is the launch of the System for Award Management, SAM. Presently, it combines 3 existing reporting systems to make a more efficient award management process. UVA, along with the Association of American Universities, Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, and the Council on Government Relations, applauds the task force bipartisan efforts to address some of these duplicative and burdensome reporting regulations while expanding transparency through the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act. Importantly, the legislation mandates the establishment of government-wide data standards and tasks the Office of Management and Budget with reviewing current reporting requirements and reducing duplication. We appreciate that universities are explicitly mentioned as a stakeholder for the output in the OMB process. We also support and would be happy to participate in the pilot program to evaluate consolidated recipient reporting. We support this legislation and hope to be a resource as this moves forward. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you all for your comments. And we've been joined by Senator Whitehouse. We'll do 5-minute rounds here, and then for the first round, we can kind of turn this more informal. Mr. Zarensky, I just the RAP board you spoke about.
Yes.
Yeah. Why have they? I guess, has this been OMB's reluctance to grant them the authority? Has it been Congress's lack of willingness to grant them the authority to do the kind of centralized work and decision-making? Can you explain that a little bit more to us?
Are you talking about the GATT board?
Yes, I'm sorry, the GATT board.
I know we have the GATT board
Yeah,
and the
GATT
RAP board.
No, I'm saying, yes, I meant the GATT board, not the RAP board, yes.
Yes. In terms of the GATT board, that is the way the executive order was set up, so that the board has what we would call a loosely knit strategic direction, but it does not have a clear line of authority. And that is something that we feel very strongly about. And frankly, even if it was set up that way in executive order, executive administrations can change. So we believe in the permanence of legislation. So the concept of clear lines of authority we think is essential to having good transparency, as well as the permanence and structure of legislation.
Well, again, I know the Data Act, we've reworked a couple of times, and it doesn't answer everything. And candidly, I was originally hoping that we would move towards even greater requirement of moving towards a more single financial standard. I've been advised we need to take this step by step, but you would concur that the Data Act would move us at least in the right direction here. While we're not directly addressing some of the things on the GATT board.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. The Data Act has the concepts that we believe are important that our work showed. So, for example, on standardization, that's exactly what it would do. And this is something that does take some time, so a phase-in period may be useful because we're talking about agencies reconfiguring their reward systems so they would then be consistent with the payment systems. Agencies have to redo their financial systems anyways over time so that a strategic vision of doing that would work, and that's very much consistent with legislation you're talking about.
Mr. Lee, again, I think Senator Ayotte and I looked at each other kind of astounded when you mentioned the school lunch programs that don't indicate they're spending any money, or the Medicare programs that don't look like they're spending any money. I mean, how does this pass the smell test? I mean, is it why isn't this information more known, that we have a system that's so kind of out of whack? When you've got data like this that is on the face so obviously wrong. I know that sounds like a bit of a naive question, but...
Not at all. I think part of the problem is that no one's doing any smelling, or historically hasn't been. Senator Ayotte referred to the Maritime Administration earlier. They're a favorite of mine. They, for a period of time when I was working on the Subsea Scope project, just didn't report any spending at all. And of course, when there are no records, it's difficult to identify a problem. We were able to find a point of comparison that exists elsewhere in the government to identify mismatched spending, but this was quite limited. In fact, we were only able to look at grants and other types of assistance spending. There's no comparable point for contract spending. That's still something we're endeavoring to work on. In our experience talking to both OMB and the agencies, we were impressed by the professionalism of everyone involved. And I used Medicare as an example, but in fact, the people we spoke to at HHS were going through incredible lengths to make sure that their obligation data was correct and that it was uploaded to USA Spending. It was only confusion about the disclosure burden that ultimately led to these data quality problems, and the fact that nobody at OMB was mandating or paying sufficient attention to these systems to ensure data quality.
I want to get to Mr. Kane, but are there examples at state or local areas where they've got it right? Have you guys worked through and said, here are some best practice examples at other levels of government?
There are a number of state checkbook sites that we've reviewed that show real promise, although we haven't conducted as comprehensive a data quality analysis. I will say that internationally, there are a number of examples of governments that are getting this right. We recently published a case study regarding the Slovakian procurement tracking system. They do a wonderful job. So I think that there are exemplars that we can turn to as we try to implement these systems.
Mr. Kane, I want to just get one quick question. Can you estimate with this multiple reporting requirements combined with this invoicing process, have you been able to compute, even in a kind of a generalized range, how much additional administrative cost burden, and whether this is actually, do you have to pay for this, can you pay for this out of any of these federal grants and kind of an overhead account, or does it have to come out of a separate budget?
So we have not calculated that. It's just that you can, by the workload that our department has and what we've got to do each month to get these things out, you can, it's a push for the staffing that we've had, which is not, usually comes from the state. So, the university is a state-supported institution. So the grants themselves do not pay for this directly.
Senator Ayotte?
Thank you. I want to thank the witnesses for being here. Let me just ask up front, how do we measure, is there anything that is out there right now where we're measuring performance? So we're talking about, obviously, data that connects the payment to the recipient, and we're not there yet, as I hear the witnesses of where we want to be, and particularly since if $900 billion is not in usaspending.gov, that's a huge amount of money that isn't being accounted for in terms of transparency. And but I'm also interested in hearing your thoughts on the next step. So we have this step to get right, but my sense is that there's very little within our government that is ever required to measure whether the money that we're allocating toward particularly grant programs, you know, has any result. So I just wanted to get all of your thoughts on that piece of it as we start this discussion.
Well, I'm happy to start off. I think that the answer to your question begins with what Mr. Chairman mentioned at the beginning, and that is GPRA modernization. This is an act that would require agencies to essentially establish the types of performance goals that you're talking about, outcome-based. So typically what we find in agencies is they're very good at outputs. You know, so many units of this done, so many of that done, but not to what end. So it's to establish, one, those type of outcome goals, two, to set those goals at an agency level, program level, and roll them up so that you can then prioritize, and three, to populate them with data that shows what your outcomes were achieved, but also links it to what was spent. So we're talking about essentially a system that runs multiple steps.
So how far are we away from outcomes on that?
We have some in some places. Some agencies are further along than others, but we have a start in that direction. There's a long ways to go, but you still want to then populate it with what you're expending to. So there's a lot of pieces still. I would say it's early. That would be my assessment.
To add to that, I would say that these systems do include some attempts to measure performance and efficiency. For instance, in USA Spending, there's the concept of the subsidy rate associated with loan records, which is supposed to capture an estimate of how many of the loans in that portfolio default. Under the Recovery Act, recipients were also required to report the number of jobs created for each associated grant. The problem with all of this is that the guidance and actual implementation has been inconsistent. So having different recipients try to figure out the formula for calculating the number of jobs created leads to a tremendous amount of errors. This occurs around that loan subsidy rate figure at the agency level as well. These measures may or may not prove to be useful, but centralizing authority over them so that they can be implemented in a consistent way that allows comparison across programs is a necessary first step.
Mr. Kane, I don't know if you had any thoughts on
So to latch on to the Recovery Act, so when we were counting jobs created, I sat in a meeting at the beginning of that with 3 different federal agencies, and none of them could agree on how we were to count how many jobs.
Well, there
were
was so
created.
much inaccuracies with that. I mean, you basically had people who had existing jobs, and whether when they had some piece of recovery funding that, I mean, there was obviously, I think that was very hard to measure and all of that. So, Mr. Lee, you know, the work that you've kind of dedicated your life to on the Sunshine Foundation, if you were in our position, so if you were elected to the United States Senate and were carrying on your work, but as a policymaker now, what would be the #1 priority for you to get done legislatively? Like, if you were in charge, what would you do?
I think the most important thing that could be done around spending data systems is to make the systems that are used for public disclosure to inform Americans the same as the ones that agencies use to track their own spending and report within government. Right now, that's not the case at all, and it makes the public disclosure systems an afterthought, by and large. Ultimately, we'd like to see a unified stream of reporting that lets dollars be tracked from the budget to obligation to disbursement. I think that last linkage is likely to happen thanks to the Data Act and the centralization of authority within Treasury. But there's going to be continued challenges as we try to create a really unified picture of federal spending.
Mm-hmm. And in your testimony, your written testimony, Mr. Czerwinski, you talked about, you mentioned predictive analytic technologies that can identify fraud and errors before
Yes.
payments are made, and data mining and data matching techniques that can identify fraud or improper payments that have already been awarded.
Yes.
I was fascinated by that. Can you provide us with an example of how that technology has been used and a success story? And are these technologies available to agencies as a whole? And, you know, just where are we on this?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And the answer to that begins with the capacity that the RAT board has in something they call the ROC. I know we call it different names. It's the Recovery Operations Center. And what they did is with recovery.gov data, because those data were complete and accurate and consistent, they were able, the spending of that, they were able to look for patterns and actually identify issues with maybe crossing agencies, crossing programs where certain maybe people were on debarment lists or people were getting multiple awards, and could actually find these early on. Now, the question that you make about whether this can be replicated, that is the next step, because what you have is this capacity that's been built up centrally. The idea then is to share it with other federal entities, to share it with state and local, because you can have economies of scale of taking this protocol, these information that are out there and sharing them, and how to do it. And that's the next step that needs to be done.
Thank you all.
And just before we move to Senator Whitehouse, I do think GIPRA at least started to look about how do we evaluate performance, but it was still pretty much within agency. So within DOE, there'd be this. But when you look at something like workforce training, which crosses all these different agencies.
This whole issue of the duplication,
Yeah,
how do
the
we get it?
duplication, we're not getting to that part of it is because I think, and I don't want to pretend that data is some panacea, but if you don't at least have common financial standards and common definitions of what may be a grant versus an expenditure, and you know, it really makes you wacky.
Right.
That's a technical political term.
No, I think you're right, and I think the other obviously challenge we have too is that, as you know, when a particular district receives a certain grant, and then, regardless of the fact that there's 10 other grants doing the same thing, we also have to look at it, and I know that you've been focusing on that, and Congress says it's not just about, you know, bringing home the bacon to my particular district. It's about, does this help the country as a whole, and therefore my state? So I think that's one of the challenges we face around here.
Let me also turn to my friend and colleague, Senator Whitehouse. It was actually his idea originally to create this working group. He was the originator of this, and he cares deeply about it. And particularly, he has been absolute leader in the Congress on how we drive some of this better data around healthcare. So thank you again for joining us here, Senator Whitehouse.
Well, thank you, Chairman Warner, and I want to thank our active and interested ranking member, Senator Ayotte, as well. Credit really goes to former Chairman Conrad for doing this. I did urge him to, but it's the chairman's call to do this, and it was Kent Conrad who made that call. And we all agreed that Senator Warner, who had been the governor of Virginia when it was the best managed state in the Union, subject that, there we go.
Get that for the record, please.
That Senator Warner would dedicate his considerable energies effectively to this committee, and he has, and I want to applaud both him and Senator Ayotte for the way in which they've led it. I agree that this question of having a data foundation for policy and for watching spending is vital. It's my understanding that USA spending was actually designed to capture a specific kind of spending, which was contract spending over $25,000. So if that's the case, I'm not sure it's completely fair to fault that program for not taking into account things that it wasn't told to take into account, i.e. spending that isn't contract spending over $25,000. But I take your point that because of that limitation that was put on it, it doesn't provide the complete picture that others are looking for, and I look forward to being able to work with you to expand that. It appears from your testimony that we seem to be agreed that the Recovery Act data and transparency standards were better than average and are something that would be wisely extended, continued, applied in other areas. And I'd like to ask those of you who comment on your testimony, particularly Mr. Chewinski and Mr. Lee, just to be a little bit clearer, I mean, do you really think that those standards are like best in show or just better than average? Are they a good starting point that we should expand to the rest of government, or are they kind of a launching point from which we should do further improvements before expanding it? Which way would you have us go? Expand first and then improve, or improve first and then expand?
I think the Recovery Act set out some very good ideas, and you have to think about the time frame and time that it was done. It had to be done very quickly. So it did require a burden on the recipients, and that's something you'd probably want to improve upon going forward.
Reducing that burden.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Now, that's a type of platform is called as recipient reporting. The Recovery Act didn't build on the existing data systems that we have primarily on the payment side because it's too difficult and too long under that compressed recovery period to get consistency, i.e. data standardization. So that's the area that you'd want to use to focus in on your improvement. Okay. Now what recovery also has, though, that you want to just replicate is the concept of stakeholder involvement and clear lines of authority. In this case, the Recovery and Accountability Transparency Board and OMB, by legislation, had control over what was done. And that's something that's missing now for going forward. Also, in terms of...
My time's running out, and I want to have
Okay,
Tilly have a
okay.
turn, so if you could sum up your answer.
Okay. And the stakeholder involvement is very good. The Recovery Board also has very good staff, and you'd hate to lose that resource.
Gotcha. Mr. Lee.
First, to clarify, USA Spending is intended to cover direct assistance as well as contracts. The unified two data sets created in the late 70s, early 80s called FADS and FPDS-NG, and expanded FADS to some extent. So that information is supposed to be in there, and in some years it is, at least as block grants to states. As far as the question of expanding the disclosure mandate versus improving the quality of the data, I think the mandate is fairly broad already. The real problem is implementation, both from agencies not reporting and from difficulties related to subrecipient reporting not coming in completely. As we've discussed, the Recovery Act's mandated fields like jobs created, I think is open to review. One of the nice things about the way the Data Act is currently structured is that it allows flexibility in terms of some of the technical standards going forward. And I think it might be worth looking at the question of what disclosures and what fields are specifically mandated in law versus the ones that those administering data would have the flexibility to alter if necessary in order to harmonize data sets.
Okay. Let me close by telling Mr. Kane that I have run administrative agencies, I have litigated administrative agencies, I have overseen administrative agencies, I have worked legislation for administrative agencies, and one of the things that I have learned over those years is that if you are a legislator and you lose the substantive fight that you would like to win, very often your consolation prize is a reporting requirement, and that those reporting requirements take on a life of their own, and they can live on beyond the fight for which they were the consolation prize. They can live on beyond the career of the legislator who stuffed them into some bill. They can live on virtually eternally. And I think you've got a Wahoo majority present on this committee right now, and you're an honorary one, right, from having been governor of Virginia? You're chairman of the board, right? There you go. Point of the chairman. So we'd be very interested in hearing from you some specifics about the, at least I would. I sit on the HELP committee, and we're going to be looking at a higher education bill, and I'd love to be able to work with my colleagues on that committee to try to reduce some of those the dead hands reaching from the past that were based in a political defeat for somebody, but now still require some poor person to have to sit down and scribble out report after report after report that, in some cases, I believe, nobody actually reads.
I'm sure there's plenty of that. I'm not prepared to say specifics about it, but as this committee does its fact-finding, I invite any of your staff to come down to my office and sit with our folks as they go through, and we'll show them examples. They can actually see the mechanics of what reports go to what agencies, why this is done this way, why this one's done that way. And I think it would give you a real good insight into how things are actually working. So that invitation is open for your folks.
Well, usually I think we've got it completely backwards. The group whose convenience is maximized is the group that requires the report. And the group whose convenience is less important is the group that has to fill out the report. And the group that's barely considered at all is the public, which is supposed to get the advantage of reading a useful piece of information when it's all done. And we need to turn that upside down so that it's most convenient for the public to get this information. It's more convenient for the institutions to provide it. And if that means it's even more inconvenient for the government to organize it in such a way that the institutions and the public have more convenience, we should be willing to bite that bullet, because ultimately that's where the rubber meets the road. It's the interface with the public.
Correct. No, I agree with that. And
I've gone on too long, but I appreciate the Chairman's indulgence.
I appreciate you coming here, and I couldn't agree more. I do want to give one good piece of information. I apologize about stepping out, but from a Virginia-based facility, Wallops Island, we just launched the largest rocket we ever have, the Antares from Orbital Science. So, not on Syria. For scientific purposes only. Let me follow up with where, I think all three of us are going, but where Senator Whitehouse, I think, drilled down. Mr. Zirinsky, you have at GAO, pointed out the duplication on the programs, and you've also on some of the reporting, and I really applaud that work. And we actually been talking to some of my colleagues about how we could actually eliminate some of this reporting duplication. I guess, Mr. Lee, one of the things I'd like to hear from you as kind of the largest advocates and the brand name around Sunlight and transparency, how we can get at this issue that I think Senator Whitehouse and Senator Ayotte and I are both have raised, what seems to be an implicit contradiction, that by actually cutting back on the reporting, we might actually be able to be more transparent. And can you help us? Can you help us on that? Can you help us articulate how that is? Because again, as a relative short timer here, I agree with Senator Whitehouse. People want to make a legislative change, and they're not successful getting a legislative change, so the Booby Prize becomes, you get a study with an ongoing reporting requirement that may or may not ever be revisited. But how do we get at this issue?
I think the perspective we bring is that we're aware that there are a number of competing priorities within agencies, committees, everywhere, and a limited amount of attention, patience, resources will be brought to questions of transparency. We want to make sure that they're spent as effectively as possible. So, for instance, when FFATA mandated the expansion of the FADS system into FADS Plus and added a few new fields, it didn't actually get rid of FADS. Instead, this subset of the data continued to be reported to Census and maintained, released quarterly instead of on the more frequently updated basis that FADS Plus was through USA Spending. Really all that was required was some central authority that could pare away this duplicative system and put those resources toward better ends. So while I think there is obviously a tension between reporting burdens and the needs of the public and oversight bodies for transparency, there's some obvious wins here that can be eliminated.
Well, we would just, at least the senator would really invite your cooperation and collaboration on this, because I think that's, and I again want to compliment the GAO, when you've got so much data and it's so incomprehensible and there's not these common standards, I'm not sure we're getting to that goal of greater transparency for the taxpayer or for us as policymakers. I want to ask you all one other question and cede more time to Senator Yachts, and then we can go back and forth. One of the questions we had in an earlier version of the Data Act, there was this idea of, let's take the goal to try to get common financial standards and create a large new entity. And we've come to the conclusion that perhaps the better way is to actually reinforce and beef up the activities that are being done at Treasury and trying to have them be the repository for creating these common financial standards. I'd just like to get, and Mr. Kane, this may be outside your purview, but for Mr. Zirinsky and Mr. Lee, is that the right approach? Are we taking the right approach in data and working this through Treasury rather than creating some new enterprise?
Well, I'm willing to start, Mr. Chairman. I think the key is what capacity you bring and what responsibilities go with it. So, for example, let's pick the Recovery Board right now. They have very strong resources that have already been built up and have been practiced. So that's something you want to maintain in whatever institutional structure you have. You want to get those resources someplace. The point that we make about responsibilities, wherever you place something, it's very important to set certain standards that have to be met, for example, involving stakeholders. So whether it's in Treasury or someplace else, you want to have it so that it addresses the needs of the people who are receiving the funds, not just the needs of the system. So we're agnostic about institutions, but we're very strong about the principles that you want to build into whatever institution.
Can you give me, let me just follow up very briefly here. Sure. You know, I got harangued by staff that the idea that we're going to get to a common federal standard would be, federal financial standard would be a bridge too far. We need to start with more just pilots and whatever. But what kind of timeline should we, you know, you see the rest of the world being transformed and new technology-driven financial data systems that businesses and consumers use in a fairly easy fashion. Why should we accept or be willing to accept what seems to be such a long transition period for the federal government to kind of get its act together on this stuff?
Yeah, I think you have a nice comparison between contracts and grants. In terms of contracts, what you have is a requirement by 2014 that you will have uniform identifiers that are consistent across all agencies. So there you have a time frame already in place for half of that $1 trillion that you're talking about. Now, what that's based on is a platform of capacity. In terms of contracts, you have the federal acquisition regulations, which standardize things. You don't have quite that in place with grants. So grants will be a little bit more difficult, but just to leave things open-ended, that's a problem that we have when that is done. We believe that there should be, and this is one of our recommendations, that there should be time frames, there should be deliverables, and that they should be held accountable for that. So we're right on line with what you're talking about, that it will take some time, but the only way we'll shorten the time is by setting time frames.
Thank you, Senator Ayotte. And I'm very glad to be joined by Senator Portman, who is, as I mentioned, the co-sponsor, lead co-sponsor on the DATA Act as well, and really appreciative of his strong work in this field.
I just have a couple brief follow-ups, and then I know that my colleague, Senator Portman, is here. Let me just, one of the things as I heard Senator Whitehouse relay his experience of having worked with administrative agencies, I've seen that myself, and I often think that when we, obviously the structure of how we do this reporting and what we're trying to accomplish on the uniform reporting, I think needs to remain stable. But when we're talking about specific reporting requirements that aren't inherent of all the basic financial data, should we be looking at, you know, sunsetting some of these things? And also, I also am a fan of sunsetting programs as well, because it seems to me that in the absence of some forcing mechanism within this body to review the effectiveness of something, it just continues to live on. And so when we talk about deadlines and accountability, I think that we here don't enough put limits on what we're enacting, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. You know, certainly some things we wouldn't, you know, if you've got a basic structure, you're not going to revisit the basic structure necessarily but a lot of things, it just seems they go on and on with no end date of things we ask you to do.
I certainly think that the fields and specific requirements for disclosure are worth review. I would be hesitant to suggest sunsetting disclosure requirements simply because those disclosures haven't been made. Non-compliance strikes me as something that needs to be addressed first through more serious sanctions and consequences for programs that have an obligation to report prior to ending those programs. Although, of course, review at any time may be appropriate.
I'll give you a shot at it. I think the concept of sometimes things have seen their life and they need to be terminated is exactly
Well,
correct.
like thinking about all the multiple duplicative
Yeah.
programs, it's like they keep living, nobody reviews
Yeah.
them, nobody has any accountability on it.
Yeah.
Even if we have all the data, if somebody doesn't act on it, then we're going to continue going where we are.
Yeah, and staying just within the concept of transparency, I think that concept applies there too. And what I would throw out are a couple principles. One is, and this is something that Tom got at in his statement, and that is there are certain pieces of information that are required to be reported that the agencies don't need, and therefore they're not ensuring their accuracy. It's the same as what Jerry was talking about, some things that he has to report that don't help him managing, and therefore it's an extra burden, and maybe we're not consistent. So I think what you can do is you can say, where are the requirements and overlay that don't improve the awarding of a contractor grant, the management or a contractor grant, or how the recipient handles a contractor grant, and that can then lead to it's not just additional work, but it also leads to greater inaccuracy and greater inconsistency. So it's a lose, lose, lose if you don't do the discipline that you just talked about.
I thank you all for being here, and I appreciate this important topic. Thank you.
I would just, before I turn this to the report, want to just mention, I had as a first 6 months of being a senator here on this committee, this idea of could you actually eliminate some programs? Thought that I could take the lowest hanging fruit, which OMB comes up with a program elimination list. And so I said, well, why don't we take the ones that
Well, and
both-
also they recommend that to the president,
Right.
don't they? And then the president accepts
You'll listen,
any.
you'll like this part. I said, well, why don't we take the ones that both the Bush administration and the Obama administration had agreed upon?
Right.
16 programs in total, $1 billion, many of them quite small. It was a great, it was like, I guess, Congress 101 for me, because you'd think that I was, calling for the destruction of the whole federal government. And these were programs that both Obama and Bush had agreed upon. So we got to work cut out for us.
If you want someone to take this fight on with you again, count me in. Thank you.
So, somebody who's been working on this issue long before both of us, and has
Yes.
got great bona fides here. And again, want to thank him for his co-sponsorship of data, since he's seen this both from the administrative side and the latest legislative side. Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your courage in taking on this issue as a Democrat. And to my colleague from New Hampshire, it's great that you're the ranking member in this effort. And just listening to your questions there and your commitment to this, I'm glad we have this forum and this opportunity to promote it. So, look, I wish I'd been here for the whole meeting. We were at the Finance Committee, and I got to go onto the floor and something else. But I just want to thank you all for what you're doing to promote transparency and sunlight being the best disinfectant, and simplicity, so that not only can you and your organizations understand better how every dollar is spent, but we can let our constituents know. My background on this is that when I was at OMB, the Coburn-Obama legislation was introduced. I supported it and implemented it initially. Actually, we went out and used a private sector website because we didn't have the ability to move as quickly as we wanted to using government technology. So we actually purchased that original website platform from an outside government watchdog group in 2007, usaspending.gov. Anyway, enormous challenges as Chairman Warner has talked about, trying to get at this issue. But I think we made progress across the board. Data uniformity is something I'm very interested in, and I know you guys have talked about that today. Certainly, the burdens, reporting burdens and compliance costs, we got to be cognizant of that. This Data Act that Senator Warner has introduced, and I'm the co-sponsor of, we think is helpful because we think it does create more transparency by setting these government-wide financial standards or data standards, streamlining some of the reporting requirements, improving the quality, therefore, of the data that we're getting, and using that improved data more effectively. Here in the Budget Committee, we often find ourselves in a situation where we're asking agency heads about their data. Department of Defense comes to mind, and we can't get the information. We're really not doing effective oversight. So not that it should be all about us, but it would help if the people's representatives had the ability to get this data as well. So maybe, Mr. Czerwinski, just ask you quickly, do you think establishing a more accurate system that tracks all federal spending is important to the work you're doing? In both the recent GAO report and your testimony today, you emphasized that while OMB and the GAT board have begun these standardization initiatives, linking systems, better utilizing information, that the current mandates come primarily from the executive order in June 2011, which doesn't provide authority to implement some of these much-needed reforms. So what do you think about the Data Act? Does that help you to be able to do your job?
Oh, yes, Mr. Portman. What we agree with, one, is the need for legislation because you want to institutionalize this. Two, the kind of concepts that are in the Data Act, we support completely. The need for standardization, so you have uniform reporting, the involving recipients in what's being done. So we are completely in alignment with the goals of the Data Act. As far as information for oversight and allowing us to do our job, for one, we very much believe in congressional oversight, so we come into that perspective. But I'll give you an example. We were asked by the House Committee on Appropriations, as well as the Black Caucus, to determine where funding was going to disadvantage rural and urban areas for community economic development. The data just weren't there to do that. And how can decision makers make decisions when the data aren't there? And how can we do our job supplying you with the information you need when the data aren't there either? So yes, there are tangible, real costs to not doing this.
That's a great point, and we're entering into an era here where we're going to be having tighter budgets regardless of what happens with the CR and the debt limit. There'll be more and more pressure, and some of us hope sequester can be relieved somewhat, more flexibility. But this need for data, as you say, is going to be greater and greater across the spectrum, and the political spectrum, in terms of how do you more efficiently target that federal dollar to programs that work. That's a good point. So it seems to me the act is coming at a time when there's a particular need on having this information readily available. To Mr. Lee, you've been an advocate for greater transparency across government, including getting some of this financial data to the public. I guess I would ask you how expansion of financial data could be used by organizations like Sunlight or other researchers in academia. How could better data, more complete data, be analyzed from outside groups to help make government more accountable to the citizens who represent?
Well, I think we can't overemphasize how central this stream of data is for reporting on the activities of the government. It previously powered the Consolidated Federal Funds Report when it existed. And if you open any GAO report on program effectiveness, you're likely to see caveats about the data quality problems inherent in these data sets. It's a persistent problem for people both within and outside of government. So I would say that improving the quality is absolutely essential for anyone who's trying to oversee the use of these funds, the effectiveness of these funds, and the general structure of it, who doesn't have access to the internal systems at Treasury or agencies that can't be open to the public in general.
Listen, I'm over time. Thank you, Mr. Kane. Thanks for your work at UVA. I know you had an opportunity to talk about that earlier, and we can learn from your examples it's a Commonwealth, right? Yeah, as the governor will remind me, in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Portman. I just have one last question. One of the things, and this goes back to kind of Mr. Kane's earlier comments, and I'd like to hear your response as well, of this duplicative reporting and reporting versus invoicing versus lost reports. As the administration and all governmental entities, move to more of a cloud-based computing function, shouldn't conceptually the ability to be that if you filed that report then once, it should be in the cloud, and it should not be then, it should be more than the government's responsibility to find it, rather than do you have to going back and refiling a second, third, or fourth time and trying to get that architecture right. And maybe we'll start with Mr. Kane and go down the list really quickly, and then we'll close up this hearing.
Yes, that would make life very easy for everybody. If the information was filed once, that it was there, and that it's not duplicated in multiple reports. But my own personal experiences with this, it also creates a cash flow problem for the university because we're not getting paid in some of this stuff because they're looking for paper. Some of this stuff is done electronically. You talk about the cloud, but there's still a lot of paper-based systems out there, and I think that's a lot of where the problems are.
Mr. Lee, obviously, there's privacy issues involved here too, but have you all thought through this notion of how we can use the cloud to both better share information, avoid some of this duplication, commonize the standards?
Absolutely. I think it's important to stress that centralization of data collection efforts is not only going to reduce the reporting burden, but will actually improve data quality. When Sunlight, for instance, investigates lobbying reports, we see that General Motors and GM show up as different entities. Unifying those systems in a simple autocomplete form, very basic web design stuff, can make sure that that's the same record in the database. I should also stress, though, that in addition to the need for centralization of authority over these processes that the Data Act moves toward, it will be important to look at other measures that are currently in effect, like the Paperwork Reduction Act, that make it difficult to modernize disclosure systems.
Yeah, I would love to get, I know enough about the Paperwork Reduction Act to be dangerous, but not enough to know it substantively. So I'd love to get you to share with our staff some of your concepts and ideas on that. Mr. Zirinsky,
Yeah,
you get the
Mr.
last
Chair-
word.
Yeah, I agree completely with the points that Jerry and Tom just made. And to me, what this comes down to is the concept of pre-population. And it has the benefits they talked about: efficiency, accuracy, completeness. What it also does, it goes back to the very point that we talked about at the start, and that's data standardization, which is exactly what you have in the Data Act. So the platform is almost irrelevant, whether it's the cloud or whatever. It's the concept, and the concept gets you to where you are. So yes, it's a legitimate way to go. And again, it's further reason why there should be legislation such as this.
And I guess I'll close out with, when we looked for best practices, I'm intrigued that you picked Slovakia as the place, but I do recall back when I wore a business hat, that this is not a unique problem to the federal government and enterprise. Large corporates, many of them in the technology space, complaining about lots of systems that weren't, that didn't work that well together. You know, do you think we're doing enough? And does, even if we pass the Data Act, which I hope we will, you know, how do we make sure that we get enough kind of not just recipients like the University of Virginia, but how do we make sure we get the advice from best practices, whether they are other governmental entities or private sector entities that can have input into the system? Any suggestion on that?
I'd say the Data Act has some provisions for the use of current technologies, and as I've mentioned, it allows for flexibility in, for instance, the data formats that are employed. Future-proofing, as we say when we're engineering, is an important part of this, and the use of open, non-proprietary formats is an essential ingredient. Beyond that, I would say that there's, to some extent, in my experience, a backlog of expertise within government that knows how to improve these systems, but is stymied in one way or another. I think centralization under data and the removal of other barriers to doing a better job could let us tap that expertise.
Anyone else? Well, again, I want to thank all three of you for very good testimony and for, I think, a subject that merits a lot more attention. And my sincere hope is that when we see the kind of broad-based bipartisan support in the House on data, that we can duplicate that here in the Senate, and that we can get this tool in place that will help you, but more importantly, help the public at large and us as policymakers make the right decisions. So with that, again, my thanks, and hearing's adjourned.